They say we should have known better than to fall so deep down into this rabbit hole we found. And I was thinking,
hi, this is Nico. You're listening to my dad Fall, also known as the White Rabbit, and James Jardine on the one and only Down the Security Rabbit Hole podcast. Buckle up and enjoy.
deep into this pool of regrettable situations. Pitch black, think back to the last time that we
were happy. All right. Good morning, good afternoon, and hey, good evening. Welcome down the Security Rabbit Hole to part 2 of the SAP discussion on the Down to Security Rabbit Hole podcast. This is Raph. Before I get going, I want to tell you guys, if you're watching the video, you should be, check these out. I've got a bunch of these made, all right, and I am going to be, I'll send them out if you want one. There's a note on LinkedIn I put up. If you repost one of our podcasts, add some thoughts and comments to it, let me know. I will send you a sticker. And of course, if you're a guest, I'll send you one as well. So let's talk episodes. All right. Joining me are my typical cadre of good time guys. James, welcome back.
Thank you. You have a typical cadre of Jims.
That's right. But it's James and Jim. All right. It's not just Jims. I got to be careful. And Jim, welcome back.
Oh, it's good to be here. I'm really looking forward to this because I was a listener for the first episode of this, and I was really excited. So this is gonna be a doozy.
All right. Well, returning are Jay and Tom. Jay, Thoden van Velzen of SAP. Welcome back, sir.
Thanks very much. Happy to be here again.
You've been on so many times. I'm getting your name correct.
Look at that.
Look at that. And Tom Venables, local Atlanta resident who I haven't met yet.
Yeah, we do need to catch up. It's good to be back.
This feels wrong that you've lived here for a couple months and we haven't gone out for a beverage yet. All right. Part 1 of this, if you guys listen, we went through and talked about essentially SAP security, right? Like what's the thing? What are we talking about? That was episode 612. And so now here we are a bunch of episodes later, 618, I think, talking about the follow-up to that. So we went high level. We're going to do a deep dive. We're going to talk through some implications for the cloud. We're going to talk through relationships between CISOs and the SAP security team, AppSec implications. We're going to talk about when things go bad. And then, Jay, we're going to hit your topic at the end about the bridge building. That was the bridge that's made. What was the bridge made out of rocks? No, what was the build the Monty Python? We'll build a bridge out of a. That reference did not work so well. All right, I'll try that later again. All right, first, let's dive in. So, as we kind of left off last time, this is a topic that SAP security specifically for ERP platforms and those business critical systems. We were talking about a lot of this on premise. Let's think about what happens when you move, which is happening a lot, right? Things are going SaaS. Jay, this is something you guys probably talk to your customers a lot about, going from on premise and pushing things to the cloud. What are the implications of that? I mean, cloud makes things secure, right?
It does, but it depends how you do it. Right?
Love it.
There is a program of doing it with us or our premium partners, which means that it has to meet our standards. You could also do it yourself. Then you have all the hassle that you have on premise, plus you have to learn all the cloud stuff too, right? What we have the benefit of is that we don't do it just for one system or a couple of systems. We do it for thousands of systems and across multiple cloud solutions. Which means that we can bring a lot more resources to bear, like hundreds of people in a central security organization, thousands across the organization, that are essentially working to make the cloud secure, right? Like running central CSPM programs, vulnerability programs, probably at a level that is not easy to copy if your team is a couple of dozen people, right?
And I will add, Jay, that not a whole lot of people have a couple of dozen people. Not a lot of companies have that.
That's right. And like that's in fact also one of the reasons why I am, partially because I was closely involved the last number of years to help make the cloud secure. But also realizing that a lot of teams are not nearly as, let's say, generously staffed as we are to figure out how to make this work on AWS, Azure, GCP, Ali Cloud, like a variety of platforms to protect customers so that they can focus on more the AppSec related things where we take care of network configuration, infrastructure, OS, base vulnerabilities, and so on.
Okay. Tom, I'm sure you've got a comment on this because I can see your face and I know what you're thinking. No, I don't. I do know. Like, looks like you want to say something though.
No, it's the right time to have the conversation. Everybody is moving to these interconnected landscapes. SAP isn't one ERP platform. It's a portfolio of a bunch of them. Most people are already in the cloud for procurement in the Ariba solution, for example. A bunch of them are using SuccessFactors HR as an authoritative source for their employees. So cloud adoption's been something that customers have been doing a lot, but now the ERP is starting to migrate. SAP's Rise hosting is the big one that Jay's talking about there. And it does take a lot of the pain away from the traditional cybersecurity challenges. We spoke last time about you can't patch these systems very easily. You get to get rid of some of those challenges, but as he's highlighted, the in-application stuff still remains. It's how you adopt and what you do with it.
That makes sense. What's
What's really interesting actually is how some really security, compliance, confidential industries, regulated industries have actually come to us in the cloud because they felt that was a better option for them than to do it themselves. And we're talking about like very serious organizations you've all have heard of.
Yeah. Listen, look, I've learned that over the years, whether it's in the computer space in our profession or in real life, right? Like I know the basics of electricity and the kind of wiring and that stuff, but I'm not an electrician. So if I need to replace an outlet, I can do that myself. If I need to replace a panel, I'm calling somebody, right? Because I'm not itching to meet my maker anytime soon. This is the same thing in when you're looking at complex projects. This is one of them, right? Like, hey, listen, you could DIY. There's probably a 7,000 page manual, and you could probably muddle your way through it, but probably don't.
Think of it this way, right? Like a lot of our solutions are essentially single tenant. So a lot of the solutions are deployed thousands of times, hundreds of thousands of times in certain cases, which means that whether we like it or not, like good idea to do CI/CD, infrastructure as code, etc. If you're operating at that scale, you have no choice. Right, so you essentially implement all the best practices that might be far more difficult to justify if you're doing it for one landscape and like now we need to get tooling and we need to have a full CI/CD and this, that, and the other. But it's much easier to get that organized if you're essentially forced into it by circumstance.
Yeah. And I like the analogy of DIY because a lot of customers are taking this opportunity to revert to best practice. Some of these ERP landscapes are 20 years old and they've been built out of patchworks of implementations, mergers, acquisitions. It's not one infrastructure landscape anymore. It's a car built out of welds. And so the chance to reset
That's
the
a painful way to put that.
Yeah, and this is an important point because this makes more sense to anyone in the SAP ecosystem listening, but drive towards the clean core that essentially sort of lifts a lot of the custom code that in the past was built into the product itself, sometimes even like hitting database tables itself, right? Now is kind of lifted out with the business transformation platform so that you keep a clean core, which makes updates and continuous new feature functionality, but also security patches much easier to do.
Look, so anytime centralization is good until it's not. We'll talk about that at the end, right? Like having the ability to manage a bunch of your customers' complex environments and push patches, do centralized support, updates, that kind of thing. I'm all for that, right? I think anytime you can simplify complex, I've said this before and I'll keep saying it. Anytime you can simplify a complex environment down to something where you trust the experts to do the expert stuff is a good thing to me. It's not foolproof, it's not perfect, but it's probably better than you can do with all the other things you've got to do, right?
Yeah, and our customers don't care. We're the classic
Fair
image
enough.
of the swan. They're gliding across the water, whereas we're the legs working like crazy underneath.
That's the duck. Yeah, I like it. The duck. Yeah.
But the important thing is that we've got to get those business processes uninterrupted. They don't really, the SAP teams or the users of SAP don't care where it's at. They want it to work. And moving to the cloud is one way of keeping it working with less overhead, less specialist skills required on the customer side. So it's making sense.
What specialized skills you have should be focused on the AppSec of the application itself, right? Like that's one of the things that we hope these SAP basis consultants get more time of, is to actually do the governance of the SAP systems. But
That's
not
a great transition, Jay.
take care of do I have to do an OS upgrade or patch some things that's not actually part of the SAP stack.
So we separate these. James, I'm going to pitch this one over to you because you can take this part. There's an AppSec component to this. How much do you suppose that the AppSec teams are handling that AppSec component, though?
Yeah, I think it's probably a mixed bag depending on where you're at, right? I mean, I think some organizations you're going to have much heavier AppSec involvement. Others, it's going to be more of guidance. The other question is, where does AppSec sit as far as, how deep do they go in certain things, right? Traditional AppSec has always been, we're at the code level. That's it, right? Like code, not infrastructure, not all that other stuff. We deal with doing code reviews and that type of activity, whereas you're starting to see more like product security where it sees the whole thing, right? You start talking about the infrastructure, you start talking about Kubernetes and AWS and Google Cloud, and starting to get into a lot of that, which I think is interesting to bring back around the idea of specializations and saying, hey, let the people that are good at this do this, and let the people that are good at that do that, right? Because we start spreading these things out. AppSec starts getting spread out, product security starts getting spread out, and now you're expected to be an AWS, a GCP, and Azure expert, right? And so being able to identify where that transition happens and say, okay, you're good at this, let's just focus on that, and we're going to hand these other pieces off. But I think it's a pretty heavy collaboration to understand where that change happens.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
I also think that there is a difference of domain, right? Like this is a gross simplification. So again, every SAPer, don't bite me. But this is more on a financial statement level than it is on code review level, right? A lot of the SAP stuff, it's about money, transactions, and so on. So a lot of is kind of like GRC audits, fraud, and the working of a business process with 4i review, essentially like approvals if you want to buy something over a certain amount, right? So like it essentially takes place in a very different domain. Like I find it really interesting to go from a set of like SAP security, SAP GRC discussion into a cybersecurity discussion and realize like we're not talking about the same thing at all.
Yeah, it's the same word. We're still talking about risk, but it means something very different to an SAP application owner. They're talking about license to operate issues, compliance, global tax, import, export, sanctioned parties, all of those business focused risks that they're tracking probably at a strategic and operational level. Not necessarily can somebody do a SQL injection or misuse this code base.
With that as a basis, that you're getting into what I would call that sort of balance between security and business. So it's a great transition to talk about what is the relationship between, say, for example, the CISO and the SAP team. Where's that connection get made? Just to add some more complexity to the conversation, right? So in one sense, we're talking business, application security. Let's just throw a CISO in there and see what happens.
I mean, the truth is it often doesn't. The CISO is aware of this as part of their landscape, but they might see it as 10%. It's only 10% of the endpoints, 10% of the user base. The CFO or whoever owns the SAP application might see it as 90% of the revenue. So they have very different perceptions of how important this system is. And a lot of the time, because SAP teams do themselves a disservice sometimes because of that perception of how important they are to an organization, they wield a lot of weight within the organization, and they do sometimes say, this is the way we do things. We can't standardize with patching. We can't standardize with your SOC operations. And they don't share the same taxonomy. So if we talk about protect, detect, respond, recover, they don't necessarily think of their solutions in the same frameworks that the CISO is speaking. So the way I try and bridge that gap is I tell the CISO, well, you don't have any funding to implement your controls, but the SAP team's got a bunch.
Yeah,
so connecting with that GRC element allows you to unlock spend, which helps the CISO. And then talking to the SAP team and saying, you need to contact this about reducing risk in IT terms that the CISO understands, then you can come together. But it does depend on the type of CISO that you've got, and we've talked about that in the past as well.
Just to add 2 cents to that is now that you're saying it out loud, I've experienced something similar in my past where the CFO owned, in this case, it was somewhat of we'll say a competitor of SAP, and they had their own team, and it was their own sort of IT and security team over there. And I found out that is sort of elements that I was being pulled into the more technology side, even though I really wanted to be on the business side, because I knew that's how, this is where all the beans are counted, basically, right? So there was a very much of, I don't know if it's historical, I don't know if it's cultural, what has happened, but
some of it is literally financial, and like the way cyber talks to the business, right? Like cyber resilience is now very hip in cybersecurity, right? That's been the SAP world for decades, right? Where essentially the availability and business continuity is paramount over, it's nice that you want to install that patch, but we know how much it's going to cost for that downtime. Can you articulate the impact or financial risk to fix that patch? And if you go like, there's a 10% probability or whatever for something to happen that by itself might not even exceed the cost of, having downtime, then you lose the argument, right? And that's actually one of the things that once these teams get closer together, right, it could be a really fruitful collaboration to understand that the outage of the email system may not have that much business impact, right? Like some lost labor, but if the trucks don't run and the cash registers don't ring, that might be a much bigger issue. And especially the understanding of known impact of the remediation could easily exceed the supposed or the calculated security risk, unless there's it's literally in the news.
But that's the basis of the problem. Sorry, Rob, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say I agree, right? So this feels like an outsized perception versus reality, how much attention we're paying to it is inversely proportional to how big the problem is.
And also, this is the fundamental core of it, is when it goes back to, should CISOs be business or IT, that kind of whole conversation, right? And I just don't know if we in the more traditional cyber side know how to have those conversations. And then since we're not coming to them speaking the language, frankly, security could look kind of stupid, right? You know what I mean? Right. Okay.
I think that's
is going to
actually
make it
often
go
what
down.
happens. And I'm not saying that the SAP teams necessarily, get everything that they want either, because they may want an upgrade and get overruled on the functional aspect as well, right? But by working together, I think you get that better understanding of like what's really valuable in the organization. Within the cyber security, we keep saying like, we got to be important to the business. It's not just speaking the language of the business, but also understanding which systems are really important to the business. And I think it's very difficult for many cyber teams to include these business applications into the landscape. That also comes with the rise of something like SSPM and something like that, where there's, we obsessed about phishing, but can you see the next stage from that fish into the business applications, right? That is beyond the scope of many of the cybersecurity teams.
Wow.
It's some of that disconnection, because the fact that, saying this is something that's typically more owned by CFO, like how much even involvement does the IT department have? You get these systems that come in and it's like, okay, the business does this, the business handles this. IT might have a small part to help get something implemented up front, but like really nobody on the technical side is part of it.
Yeah.
Right. And just like the business is owning this thing, and nobody, like everybody's maybe got a little bit of view through the tinted window, but they don't really know because it's on the other side of the house.
Yeah.
It's
And
not
that's
your
why it's
typical
so
IT
important
systems.
to get together, right? Because the SAP teams have challenges, the cyber teams have challenges, but once you go together to the business with a more comprehensive understanding of the business systems that affect the entire organization, you're going to have a much more realistic conversation than like, is everybody meeting their 14 days SLA, right? But focus on how are you really protecting the core systems that run the organization that pose a true business risk. And as a result, that may even result in reprioritization some things, right? Like what I keep hearing from CIOs, the only thing they care about from security is how quickly can you recover. I think that's not enough. But that gives you a really good understanding of what they think is important versus what cyber often think is important, right?
There's a distinction though between, typically I see security focusing on in-house IT.
Yeah.
Right. What do we build? How do we build it? How do we secure what we have built? And then everything else kind of, yeah, okay, great. You went to the cloud. That's not really our problem, not fully, but right. It's not the priority that a lot of people focus on, because the assumption is, oh, well, it's in the clouds. It's through a SaaS provider. It's being supported. If it goes down, they're going to bring it back up.
Yeah.
Maybe you have DR and BC around that, but it's much less visibility. I guess I'm really just trying to say a lot of security teams operate within the IT realm. Take your debate of whether it should be part of IT or not. The focus is IT. It's not the business as much, right? When we talk about functionality at that level, it's what functionality are we building, not what functionality does the business use.
But it does speak to like whether we're in cybersecurity are striking the right balance, right? Like if we get to a point where our security requirements almost get into the absurd, there's some real life examples of that, but let's just take the mythical, computer in a dark room, locked, no network, turned off, etc. Right? Like we do have it to get in that way, right? And I think the connection with SAP teams, as well as, for instance, OT teams, where you have kind of similar situations, really helps sort of redress that balance into like, we actually have to make sure that stuff runs, then run securely, and then when it fails, it recovers quickly.
I used to work with a CISO who was a heavy SAP user, and her question to me was always, okay, but how does it help me sell more hammers? Big retail group, and everything came back to, can I sell more hammers? And that's one of the big things, is the security within the application and the SAP ecosystem is a very different challenge to the technical security that we often speak about with CISOs, CIOs. We then start to talk about process security, data security. How are you looking after your customers' data? How are you making use of that big data to sell more hammers? How do you make sure that somebody can't ship hammers to your competitors or leak your price lists, or that you're exporting hammers at the right price and giving the government a slice? That is all what the security within the application is trying to achieve. So then it becomes a data segregation challenge, it becomes a data exfiltration challenge, DLP, and all of those terms that we're familiar with, as well as identity and access governance challenge. So then, we talked about application security earlier. Most applications, most organizations are running an average of 400 apps within their ecosystem. And 399 of them have 3 privileges: display, change, and administer. And then you get to SAP, where it's built with an authorization model that's object-oriented. So you can put these building blocks together in a billion different combinations. You can go down to individual data elements and secure them. And the business actually does care about that. Can somebody see my home address or just my zip code?
The other really important thing is that SAP security, a lot of it relies on human oversight in business processes. It's something that we kind of forget in cyber, because everybody wants to have like 3 factors, but you're still carrying it all together. But nobody wants to, have anybody in the company being able to like just wire 10 million, right? So that you have a human approver on top of that starts asking questions like, what's this for? Right? And like, those are really powerful controls. I'm not saying like we should go back to like gatekeepers and approvers, but there may be a really good way for certain, critical functions to just go like, it's fine that you press that CI/CD button, but you need to get another person to press that button too.
There are customers out there that have been subject to phishing attacks and masquerading in those approval functions. And then the cost of the business is that 20 million invoice that went through. People are deep faking CFOs in these systems. And, we spoke last time, the threat is increasing slowly, but they're a little behind the curve, which is an advantage for SAP. But they have started to realize the amount of revenue that customers are moving through these systems. And they're like, well, if we can target the SAP, it's material to that customer, and they're probably going to pay that ransom to get back up.
Very useful defense, when somebody got like successfully phished, and then suddenly a manager or a controller needs to go look at that before it goes through.
Yeah. Jim, you're very quiet. You look thoughtful.
So I guess my main thought going through my head, honestly, is that I feel like there's a little bit of compartmentalizing CISOs in just that technology space. I'm thinking, wow, if you're having all these experiences with organizations and feel that that's happening, it's like, man, as much as like the industry in of itself talks about being more business aligned, here we are talking to, huge players in this massive application space for some of the biggest businesses in the world, and your view is your experience is completely antithesis to that. So I'm just kind of like, whoa, that's kind of a shocker, right?
It's why
I think it depends where you look. So like we were talking CISOs, right, with the I in it. I think once you get to CSOs, right, like I think there's a greater awareness.
Yeah, and chief risk officers, if an organization is large enough to have one, that categorization of risk within the application. So, those manual controls that Jay aligned to, there are ways to automate those. So that 50 million invoice crosses a certain threshold. It's being approved outside of, things we're familiar with, attribute-based security within the application. So behavioral patterns. Are we monitoring users when they log on, where they're logging on from, how they interact with the system, and putting the right controls in place with things like MFA in-app. There are solutions that you can put in place so you can't approve anything over 5 million unless you've got your key card, your fingerprint, and your retina all on you. Those levels of business controls can be applied within that, and they're far more familiar to somebody who's coming from a CISO skill set, because we've been putting that in place across the networks, across the endpoints for so long. We're now having to apply CISO principles to business processes within the application. And I think that speaks to a little bit of how we bring those teams together, because there's good skill sets on both sides of that divide that solve the same problems, but one is coming at it from a data and process flow point of view, and the other's coming at it from a technical infrastructure point of view.
It's an interesting breakdown to think about. You know, I look at systems like this, and oftentimes you see the CISOs as being more aware than they are involved, right? Like this type of system that's going in, like, oh, they're getting ready to put this in. I'm aware of it. I attend the weekly progress calls, right? Like I do that stuff, but how much actually is behind? I've got somebody out there actually sitting in and reviewing the security of these pieces.
Well,
like we do
think
on the
about
IT
life
side.
cycle of CISOs, right? Like these systems, in many cases, have been in place for decades.
Yeah.
How many CISOs do you know that have been in the same position for decades? You inherit
Not many.
Well, and when you inherit, right, how often are you going back to go back and review it and say, hey, we've got this. I'm going to step back into this and see, what are we doing with SAP? What are we doing with this other system? And how do we have that set up? You know, and really start understanding what are like some of those deeper security pieces that exist within there. I think that's a hard part too. A lot of people don't know externally. I'm not an SAP expert. I don't know what the security controls are. You know, so what are some of the different security pieces that exist in the platform?
And unless you work for a larger organization, I'm not saying like, you probably don't run SAP if you're 500 people yet, right? So like a lot of these things, especially once the landscapes get really big, you know, you're in a large organization. So either you've worked for a large organization before with these types of enterprise applications already, or you've come through the ranks of an organization where that's the case.
But we have within the application the same types of controls that we would see in a secure operations center, right? There is event monitoring. It's just that the event that we're looking for isn't a penetration or a SQL injection or a privilege escalation within that server stack, somebody unlocking root access. We're looking for somebody going in and creating a vendor with a bank account that's linked to, I don't know, Iran. Pick a country. And we're looking for those key events and correlating them, and we're doing our indicators of compromise, but we're doing it based around the business impact of those, not the technical impact. So we're saying, what would be the implication of that? And so if we do something like a penetration test against an SAP system, yeah, you might be able to exploit an HTTP gateway, but what is the implication of that? Can I actually get to any of your critical data? Can I expose your customers? Information? Can I approve, you know, a critical business process, or can I halt a critical business process depending on what my motivation is?
You know, it's funny. So years ago, I used to say that the future of security is going to be in the concept of fraud. We're going to start changing the language from like cyber to fraud. And it's interesting, Tom, is that's exactly what you're saying, right? I mean, it's almost like a pen test. I'm using air quotes for everybody listening to this on non-video, is really going to be is like, well, how do I set up an account, right? And that has a bank account in some you know, bad country kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I think so. Are we, when we say things like application security? So we've been having this conversation, but what are some like hard examples? Like, so in other words, like, do you have like an identity access manager? Do you have like a guy that does the monitoring? You have somebody who does signatures? You have, I mean, is it just basically you just lift and ship? I mean, you said you have like everything you would have in an operations center just under the umbrella of SAP.
Yeah.
But then you kind of sort of qualified it in the fact of this, you're looking for sort of fraudulent activity. So help us connect the dots. Are you really speaking more in the broader sense of business and cyber and fraud? Or are you really saying that's the first step as we get deeper into the system?
That's the thing that people care about, that gets them to care about everything else down the stack. So what is the financial implication of this breach? And if that's a breach in process or a breach at technical level, what does it mean to my customers and to my business and my enterprise my digital enterprise resilience or my business resilience there? Is it going to stop me selling hammers, shipping cars, moving petrochemicals through my refinery? From that, you then look at all of the systems, people that are involved in that, and you start applying your controls to principles that we're all familiar with, like least privilege, segregation of duties. And start putting in those processes to monitor those events to say, has anybody opened that OT valve in the refinery that they shouldn't? So you hit some real world implications pretty quickly if there is a breach of some of these systems. But you're applying the same principles that we would do in the CISO world. Least privilege has been around for 40 odd years. Not everybody has got it right, but they're all striving towards it. But that means you've only got the access that you need to do your job, and you can't step outside that. So identity is a big part of what people think SAP security is. When I started 20 odd years ago, I was creating users, giving them role-based access concepts, resetting passwords. And then you move from that to understand the processes that you're supporting and the risks associated to those. And then I stepped outside that and said, okay, what's the infrastructure look like? And now we're having conversations like this. But it all starts with who can do what.
The risks all seem pretty use case specific, right? I mean, a couple of those examples you gave, oil refinery is going to be very different than a financial institution. Who's going through and defining what those key indicators are, right? Of that cap being open that shouldn't be opened. And
I had the same question.
This is actually why application security in a way is really very interesting compared to like infrastructure security, which is kind of, a lot of it transfers, right? But even knowledge inside of an SAP system is not enough to be able to navigate an SAP system, because it essentially mirrors the organization that it's deployed in, through its organizational structures, through its functions, through like how it's even governed and set up, right? So like you need both of that. So essentially those authorizations, you can have technical implementation of that, but like they have business functions that they directly map to.
Yeah, and that you've hit on the key problem there, James. It is industry specific, it's organization specific. I've been lucky enough to pretty much touch every industry. So I can speak to some risks, but every time I go in, I'm like, okay, what's keeping you up at night? What are you most worried about? And then we focus in on the systems and the processes that interact with those risks. So it comes back to a GRC challenge. To your point earlier, Jim, should we be business? Should we be technical? We need to understand what the risks of the business are, track that through the technology stack, and implement those controls.
Guys, so I've been listening a little bit here, and I have to say the thing that strikes me about this entire conversation is this last bit that we just had, where you guys are clearly defining a fundamentally different way of thinking within the SAP, within ERP SAP, than the rest of cybersecurity for the last 30 years. The rest of cybersecurity for the last 30 years thinks adversary, TTPs, vuln, 0 days, exploits, that kind of thing. And you don't really, I'm going to incur a lot of hate, you don't really know a lot about the business you're in, and still you can do pretty good security. That does not at all translate into your world, because if you don't know the business that you're in, you have absolutely zero chance of doing anything worthwhile. Yeah. That's the golden nugget, I think, right there. You guys just said that's the bit, because it's not enough to know security. It's not enough to know SAP. If you don't know how the business operates, what hurts it the most? Is it a disruption in supply chain? Is it payroll not happening? Is it goods sitting in a warehouse? What is it? If you can't define those things, those failure modes, don't bother.
Yeah, I've had a case of one of our customers actually in the federal area saying like, what happens? What do I need to have up and running? What are my critical systems that I need to have running? And he said their IT told them I can have email up in an hour. And he was like, I don't care. Just use Gmail. Like that. I need this system up now, because without that, we can deploy, find, and connect people with material. That is the critical system. So, like, without having that understanding, and it's not to say that everybody in cyber needs to become SAP experts, but they need to understand and have those conversations so that you come to a common understanding of what's truly important.
I was chatting to a customer this morning, and a customer outage for them, their customers can bill them $1,000 a minute if the data isn't flowing. So
that's a big number. That gets big fast. As each customer?
Yeah.
Oh.
But major oil and gas companies, their trading systems process so much per second that they start a counter that you can't see the right 5 digits move of how much money they're losing during.
Yeah, hold on. Yeah, 20 years ago, I was a part of an incident like that. I can't tell you the math exactly because it would hurt people's brains. But if we've had that hallway conversation about that thing I did by accident once, yeah, it's a big, big number. Like, nobody starts at 1. They start at like 10 million and work their way up. And then you lose, like, it falls off the page very fast. All right, listen, let's we're running out of time. So let's transition real quick to kind of the last piece I want to talk about, which is, Jay, your point about you've got infrastructure and corporate security over here under the CISO. You've got a floating island of SAP security. How do we link those two? What's the bridge between those two? What do you recommend people do? Because this is your world.
Well, like last time we talked about, like, take your SAP colleague to coffee, right? Like, the dialogue needs to start, right? And I think this is a good time. Like, the mood in cybersecurity is towards cyber resilience. Everybody is doing cloud in some way, which allows you to sort of rethink certain relationships. And I think there is a need to start this dialogue, right? So, like, just as in general, we're talking about the chase for vulnerabilities as kind of a rabbit hole, right? Like, what is the experience from the SAP team to live with that, and what sort of mitigating circumstances, mitigating controls can be put in place, right? Like, how can we reset to the things that are important and make sure the A in the CIA gets its deserved attention, and we don't go overboard with either like setting ridiculous requirements or just shutting things down, right? And I think once that bridge is made, it becomes much easier to both coherently talk to the business about true security and enterprise risk and context, so that the cyber team doesn't sound like shouting for something that's maybe a little bit esoteric and abstract, but they go together giving a good talk to the business that they can understand and is really measured to like true business impact.
Can I be a curmudgeon for a second?
Yes,
sure.
please.
Do you mind?
The eye roll that I could hear the eye roll, Jim.
I think I was bouncing off the little walls around me here in the screen. Okay, so it sounds like to me that SAP and has been, I mean, even Tom, you both were talking about, we've been doing this for 20 years kind of thing. Well, let's call a duck. I mean, it seems like you've been doing fine without the CISO. I mean, I just find it fascinating that you're not seeing more CISOs being running to your door, right? Like, hey, this is like 95% of the enterprise. Let's make it work, and fraud, and let's minimize that. And now we're having a conversation where you're saying, hey, we can help you. You can be, it's almost like you're trying to pull in.
You need to know who the SAP people are, right? Like, we had part one where Raf was kind of like, what does SAP actually do? Right, like that is the general thinking, if you're coming from a pure sort of infosec background,
Yeah.
right? So like, if you don't even know what you're going to ask,
100%.
right, or why you should talk to that person, I think this is sort of Tom and my effort to like, you
Yeah.
know, come talk to us.
I know.
right?
I
Take
know.
that
It's just mind blowing.
invitation, because I think there's often like almost a canyon between the cyber side that cares about like malware detection and antivirus and vulnerability management and like keep to your SLA, and here's a team that has like, you know, 2 change windows a year, right?
Yeah.
Like, so if you come as cyber to those teams and they legit tell you like, sorry, can't do that, you know, need to negotiate, then if you think like, oh, you know, that's just, you're not an app team like being obnoxious that they don't want to cooperate, that's the wrong approach. But like really understand why it is that they're living in that world, and like once you have a dialogue going, you know, really make a mindset change on both sides. Like I did a time in OT IoT security, blew my mind. I came in thinking like, oh, you know, we're going to tell all these guys that they should just patch. And 4 years later, I was very humbled and, you know, had learned much more than I thought I could ever impart, right? And I think this is kind of the same things. Like if that dialogue actually happens, right, and, you know, isn't so adversarial, then I think both will benefit greatly.
Yeah, the need for SAP teams to speak more cyber is there. That yes, they've been doing fine without the CISO for a while, but the threat is increasing. The landscape is evolving. You know, it used to sit in an enclave behind 28 firewalls and it was fine. That's not the case anymore. So they need to educate themselves, and the CISOs need to bring them in to do that. But likewise, they need to bring the CISO in. So I think they buy each other a coffee or a beer or whatever their beverage of choice is.
Yeah, I think the interconnectedness of everything being done by API with outside parties and internal parties, third parties, and 19th parties, and cloud have really changed that. All right, I think that's a good place to stop, because that's 47 some odd minutes of goodness. I think some of us maybe have run out of paper to write on. Folks, thanks for listening. This has been fun. Hey, before I let you go though, do make sure you follow the thing and catch me on LinkedIn. And if you'd like to grab a sticker, I'll send you one. I'll send you on a small little task. But other than that, I'd happily send you guys these. Display them proudly. We made them and they're kind of cool. So Jay, Tom, thanks for joining us for part 2 here. This has been a lot of fun. And yeah, I think maybe we'll follow this up again in not too distant of a future. James, Jim, as always, gentlemen, thank you for joining. It's been a blast seeing both of you guys again. And yeah, I think that's it. Thanks for listening, you guys. We'll cue the music. We'll catch ourselves out. We'll see you another time, another place, on another Down the Security Rabbit